Hello and welcome back to another episode of Fully Booked, the Hidden Gems author podcast, which Craig Touch and myself, Roland chat some interesting figures and leading lights in this crazy industry we're in of writing and self-publishing. Although today we are branching a little bit further than just writing and self-publishing and talking about, creativity as a whole. And to do so, we have a very special guest. He might be familiar to people who've worked with Hidden Gems before. It is Nate Allison. Nate, it is a great pleasure to have you join us today. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for being here. Glad to be here.
Well, we are delighted to have you. And of course, we wouldn't be here without the man himself, Craig Touch, the owner and founder of Hidden Gems and an author himself. How are you doing today, Craig?
Doing great. Thanks, Roland. Thanks for coming on, Nate.
Yep.
So, yeah, today I wanted to talk about AI and how it's being used in the writing, mostly in the writing sphere of things. So, and not just for writing, but for image generation, authors using it, say, for covers, for advertising, for whatever. But I want us to talk about it in the sense of, not just what we can do with it, but also whether we should be doing stuff with it and what the ethical considerations are here, because it's not just a matter of go to ChatGPT and say write a book. Not that it can, but and it's not just like pull up Midjourney and say do a picture of whatever and then use that for your cover. There are arguments on either side saying whether you should be allowed to do that. And the reason why I wanted Nate to come on here to talk to us today Roland and I could have hashed this out on our own and just talked about the issues, but not that we're experts. But Nate, is not only is he a cover designer and a graphic designer, does a lot of the graphics for Hidden Gems, but he's also listen, I don't know if it's a secret, but he's studying to be a lawyer. And again, he's not a lawyer yet, but he understands sort of the legal arguments, the artistic side of it arguments a lot better than I do, maybe than Roland does. So I think, having him on here, I want to get his perspective so that he can talk to those points and we can sort of understand what those arguments are. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. So let's start that off with, this came about sort of, I sent out an email to my newsletter showing some of the images that I had done. I recently got a computer that is able to run, my own version of Stable Diffusion, which is sort of like a, Midjourney, but you can run it on your own machine. And I showed some images that I had done to the newsletter, and I got an email from an artist saying, listen, there's a lot of ethical considerations here about this. And I'm glad that she brought that up, because it's not that I didn't know that, but I wasn't really thinking about it in terms of that. And, she was just saying, let's be mindful of those issues so that when you're saying to people, hey, look what you can do, you also want to show, let them make their own decision about whether they should do it and what they want to do with those images. So let's talk a bit about that to start us off. So Nate, what are some of the, those ethical considerations that we need to think about with the image gen specifically?
Okay. So basically the way that generative AI works is that it takes a large data set that has been contextualized, usually by human beings. And then it basically, you enter a text prompt and the prompt reads the context that has been provided. And then it outputs either text or a generative image based on your prompt and then the context. So the ethical issue is that in order for these models to work, they require huge amounts of information, both public domain information and then also not public domain. So IP that is still protected by copyright. So we're talking photographs, illustrations, entire books, basically like articles from the internet, pretty much everything that can possibly be scraped has been scraped into one of these data models at one time or another. So the ethical consideration is that at no point, or at very few points that I can think of, because I can't think of a model that is completely opt-in at the moment, the creators of this content were not consulted or compensated or given the opportunity to opt out. So when all of these new images and text and things are being generated, they're only being generated because of the backbone of protected content that's been used to build the underlying software, basically. That's the big ethical consideration, is that for everything that you make, there's some stranger somewhere that contributed to it in some tiny way. And a lot of the strangers basically in little tiny ways to make what you have. Because generative software doesn't create something new. It's just reiterating things that have already existed, basically. So that's the ethical consideration.
Now, as a thought of that, like I write romance books that are adventure stories. So I got an author called Julie Cooper and Ian Fleming who writes James Bond books, and I like smushed them together, and that's my writing style. So I basically developed my writing style from taking like the writing style of two other people that really resonated with me and a kind of like my own interpretation. So isn't that what intelligence does?
To an extent. The problem is that, I mean, we're talking about the difference between inspiration and generation, right? So if you're inspired by, let's say, Ian Fleming, and you create a character that's like James Bond, you've ripped off Ian Fleming with your new character, you know, super spy, whatever. And I mean, you're not fooling anyone. Like anyone who reads that book is going to say, "Oh yeah, you know, you probably wrote a lot of Ian Fleming books, and this is a complete ripoff." But I mean, that's not infringement. I mean, it's not something that like that would be actionable. Like, I mean, but the difference here is that with AI generation is that it's using copyrighted content to create something. So the issue is really like it's not ripping off, it's more taking someone else's work and then creating something that then ultimately competes with the person who created it in the first place, or a lot of people, like I said, because it's a huge data set. So there's tons and tons, like millions and millions and billions of like little pieces of data with little snippets of context that like create these images and books and things like that. So it's not the same as I cobbled these two things that I love together to make this new thing. Trying to think of a good way to put this. Like a human being, if they're inspired, still uses their own imagination to create something. I mean, and when you first start out creating it, whether you're a painter or you're a sculptor or whatever, 9 times out of 10, you're kind of standing on the shoulders of giants, so to speak. So you're generally making something that's very similar to someone that you grew up that caused you to like the art form that you're doing to begin with, whether that's writing or whatever. So the work that you're producing is going to be super similar to theirs because you've read it a billion times or you've consumed it a billion times. It's fresh in your mind. You want to be like them. So your writing or your sculpting or your architecture or whatever, it looks like your inspiration a lot. But eventually your own voice takes over. And that becomes like where you separate yourself and you start creating actual original work, even if you're still inspired and people will say, "Oh yeah, like clearly like that's where this came from." It's completely different with AI. AI is just building something based on a prompt. There's very little like human imagination there. I mean, the prompt is there, but all the prompt is just an idea. It's just give me this, and I mean, there's the machine takes over from there.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, I really don't see a huge difference between somebody who learns to paint, a human that learns to paint by studying a bunch of different painters and then creating something inspired by those painters from their imagination, and AI that learns from all those painters and then creates something inspired by the imagination of the prompt that was given to it. Like, I don't see a big difference there. And I think that, I mean, listen, this hasn't been decided by the courts, and eventually it will be. So there's no, I mean, there's people can argue that there's right and wrong, but I mean, it's still opinion based until something is really officially decided. But I really feel like I don't see a huge difference between those two. And I kind of feel like the arguments against are more based on what you said before, whereas this idea of unfair competition, like all of a sudden, the AI is going to unfairly compete when it learned how to draw from looking at the images of the people it's competing against. But that's the same thing with the human artist, where they learn to draw, they learn to paint by studying all these other artists, and then they're now competing when they're selling their art, they're competing against those artists. So I mean, it's on a grander scale, obviously, but I mean, that's just how technology and progress works, I think. I know a lot of people will disagree, but I'm failing to see the big distinction about why it's any different when AI does it versus when other people do it.
I think
there's lack of effort.
The distinction is AI isn't learning to paint or to draw. Like, AI isn't learning anything. It's not it's not a person. Like, it's not like, even through the context that's being provided, it's not like if you feed an AI generative model 1 billion paintings, the AI isn't a painter. Like, it doesn't understand paint. It doesn't understand brushes. It doesn't understand form or composition or any of that. Like, it's not a painter. All it's doing is it's taking a big set of data, all of the paintings that it's been given that have been contextualized, and it's mushing them together and spurting them back out again in a way that it logically thinks it's supposed to. But I mean, it doesn't understand what a painting is. Like,
but why does that matter, right? Like, why should that make a difference?
I mean, it matters because it's not creating anything new. Like,
it is though, right? You're not going to take an image that it generated and be able to put it in a reverse image search and find that image already existing.
No, I mean, you aren't, and in that respect, yes, it's creating something new to that in that scope. Like, it's a new combination of pixels, basically, that hasn't been seen before. But
which
that combination of
picture, which can be said as any picture, right?
But what I'm getting at is that, like, it's not something that, like, it's created from scratch the way, like, a new painter would. Even if they're copying someone, even if they're tracing, like, even if you have somebody who takes a piece of art and traces over the top of it, like, they're still creating more than the AI would, because the AI isn't creating anything new. It's taking pixels that already exist and smushing them together in a different way. That's what generative AI does.
I mean,
like, it's not, it doesn't make anything. It's recombining other elements in its database.
I think
but it doesn't understand why.
I think there's a big esoteric question of how different is artificial intelligence to human intelligence, because at the end of the day, that's what we kind of do, except we understand context. So, like, I write spy novels, and if he drinks a vodka martini, there's the context of, oh, that's what James Bond drinks. But at the same time, it's like I'm taking things. I mean, where is the difference between artificial intelligence and human intelligence? And is what we're doing approaching that point where the only differentiation is, oh, it's okay when a human does it?
I don't think we're anywhere close. I mean, if we were, this conversation would be very different, because if artificial intelligence was actually anywhere like human intelligence, I mean, I'd be shitting my pants right now because I'd be terrified. Like, that's like generative AI isn't, it's not AI, okay? It's not artificial intelligence at all, really. It's all it is a huge database where human beings, and not even the machine, but human beings have contextualized bits and pieces of data. With books, it's like, with art, it's different, because most of the time, like if you have a piece of art, it's contextualized, like this is a picture of a Caucasian man wearing a black jacket and he's got brown eyes and so on and so forth. So if you go into the AI and you say, I want a picture of a Caucasian guy wearing a black jacket and brown eyes, the computer is going to take all of the bits and pieces of photographs and paintings and everything it's got in the database, and it's going to iterate them and make something that looks exactly like, or close enough to what you want it to look like based on that prompt and that context. But like, that's not the way human intelligence works. Human imagination is like, I'm going to create something out of thin air. The computer's not doing that. Not even kind of.
Hold on though. Like, I mean, if I was going to draw a picture of a person with black hair, brown eyes, etc., like you described, I'm not pulling that out of thin air. I'm doing it based on my memory of what all the people I've seen that look like that. And that is kind of the same thing as of what they're doing. I'm saying, okay, like I know some people with black hair and brown eye, you know, it looks like this and like that. And I'm, you know, doing my own version of it in my own style. But I mean, I don't know, that's kind of like what,
I mean, okay, so here's the difference. Is I could tell you two guys, okay, I want each of you guys to draw me a picture of a guy with a black jacket and brown eyes. So both of you are going to draw completely different pictures from each other. But I could also ask you to do it like a billion more times. Don't do the same one twice. And you could do that. The problem with AI is that, like, it only knows a finite number of pictures or whatever that has that specific context. So eventually, like, I mean, it's going to, it runs out. Like, it can't imagine a new person the way that a human being can imagine a new person. Like, so you might draw a picture of someone you know, which is fine, but you can also imagine someone who doesn't exist an infinite number of times, and the computer can't do that.
I bet a computer can draw different pictures than what I can draw more times than I can. You know,
but that's the thing, is like, it can't. It's got a limited scope.
If you use the same prompt and you hit generate over and over and over again, you get a different picture every time. Like,
right,
it's
because
not coming up with the same picture.
Right, but the model's built on millions of images. So I mean, it has. I mean, you don't have.
But it's not
hours
in your
day
pulling.
to
It's not going through those images and finding one that matches and giving you that. It's building it based on.
It's building it based on a huge mishmash. But what I'm saying is that, like, the computer is limited where the human brain is not limited at all. Mm. So the computer, you don't have enough hours in your day to hit regen for as many images that it has in the database. That's how many there are.
But it's not a database though. It's not, I mean, it's not
it is a database.
No, okay, but it's not a database of images where it's just like, okay, I'm going to use this one this time. I'm going to use this one. It's building it. The combinations are probably more than the stars are in the sky. And I bet you if I was to draw the same image over and over again, it would very much look very much the same. Like, I don't think I could draw a different version of the same thing very many times. Like, honestly.
Well, I guess that's what I'm saying, is the computer is only as imaginative and as smart as it has the data in its database to be, where the human brain is not like that. So that's the difference between generative AI and the human mind, your human imagination, is that, like, we're not limited, where the computer will always be only as smart as we tell it to be, basically.
Yeah. All right. Well, I don't really see yet of those being, differentiator enough to say, oh, we shouldn't use it. So let's go back to sort of the reasons why we, that artists are upset about us using it in the first place. So what is that? It's the idea that it has gone through and scraped their images without their permission, right?
Right. So the issue there is one of fair use, which goes into copyright infringement. So the issue there is that artists and writers and creators in general are upset because all of their work has been used to build these generative models without their consent, without being compensated, etc. And the issue is one of fair use. So the way fair use works is that a copyrighted work can be used in a limited context. Sorry, my cat. And a IP can be used in a limited context in a small window of ways that the creator can't control. So generally speaking, when a fair use claim is considered, they have there's four tenets basically. And there is the purpose of the character of what the work is. So if you create something based on the IP of someone else, is the character of it commercial or non-commercial? So are you making it for like an educational purpose or like editorial, or are you commenting on it? Or are you creating a commercial product based on someone else's IP? So that's number one. Number two is the nature of the work, whether it's published or unpublished, whether it's fictional, non-fictional. So for instance, non-fictional things like facts can't be copyrighted. So you can you can't claim a copyright infringement over, it's cloudy outside today, like you can't do that. And then for fictional and non-fictional, but for published and unpublished, you can say, if someone has published a work, if someone is they haven't published a work, they're both the same kind of thing. So if someone is published or something is unpublished, it doesn't really matter all that much. But if it's been published and you take pieces of it, then it's more difficult to claim fair use. The third is the amount of the work that's been used, that's been infringed on. So if you take a little piece of someone's work versus the entirety of it, right? So for most generative AI models, the entire works of people are being absorbed into the model itself. In some places like books, like they're being segmented because they have to be contextualized. So, this little section of book is like, there's a knight who's rescuing a princess and she's got blonde hair and brown eyes, and all of the context for this little snippet and this one and this one and this one for the whole book. And then for an image, it might be the entire image contextualized with what the image looks like. If, if it's like a moody image, if it's black and white or whatever, all of that. So, and then the fourth tenet is the effect of a infringing work on the market itself. So if it competes directly with the original, and how, does it serve as a replacement for the original, or are people going to get confused by the new work and that kind of thing? So when people consider fair use, those four things have to be considered, and just the very first one, whether things are commercial or not, generally nips it in the bud immediately. So the problem with most AI generators is that they are commercial products themselves. So we're talking like Midjourney, Pseudo-Write, Novel AI, ChatGPT. A lot of them have like subscriptions, right? Like you have to pay to use them, and then people are using them to create commercial works. So right there, you've got a problem like right off the bat ethically, because you're creating commercial products that are created with the backbone of work that you did not create, and then you're using that to compete directly with the people who did create that backbone. So like that's where people are up in arms. They're right at the very first fair use line. They just don't want to be competed against with AI, basically.
But then what about like satire and, stuff like that, where they're basically it's still commercial. You can sell a piece of satire that is based on something and it's fair use, right? That's still commercial.
That is a defense. So satire, parody, that kind of thing, that is fair use. The problem with both satire and parody is that you can't. It's an affirmative defense. So basically, that means that you will have already been sued before you can say, but it's a parody. Like that's the way it works. It's a defense only. So you can't. It's not going to keep you from like getting in trouble. So for right now, because most AI, and I have seen instances where AI has directly like plagiarized something. It's easier to tell with writing than it is usually with images. But you can definitely see even in some images where like a watermark will come through, where it's obvious like something somewhere.
Right. Yeah. Okay. But the watermark situation though is not because it's stealing an image. It's because it was trained on a whole bunch of images with watermarks, and so the AI thinks that watermark is a valid part of an image. So it starts to recreate that as part of an image. It's not that it's like, oh, it's actually grabbing that corner where the watermark is. That's not what's happening.
Right. I mean, that's what I'm getting at is that like, I mean, but it's still the same thing. I mean, it's still, those images are still used to generate the content. I mean, it's not so much that it's putting it there in the corner where it belongs. It knows that there's supposed to be something there, like you're saying. Like it knows that like enough images have been generated with a watermark that it knows that usually there's something there. But it's still using all of its huge number of images, just bits and pieces of them, to put them all together again.
Right, which means that it's not using the full work, right? Like, which is part of the fair use, and it's not it's not like it's only taking bits, right? And that almost even proves it in the sense that like if there was one image with a watermark, it would never put that watermark in, but because it sees it in so many images. And that's why to me it's like it's building these images based on looking at so many images and finding sort of common things. And that's why, like you said, it's hard to say with AI, oh, this was stolen from this artist, because it's not really stolen. It's taken all of those images and used them to train. And so you could say, and I have seen images where it's like, do this in the style of, Salvador Dali, and then everything looks, and it's very clearly like, but it's like, you can not say that and get images that are very, very much unrecognizable to the source material, in which case I don't see how that sort of argument of fair use comes into play, because you can't even tell whose it is. And
that's only one part of fair use though, and I agree actually. I mean, I think that that's number 3, that's substantiality. So that's the amount of a work that is used in a new derivative work, right? So I agree. I don't think that I think that particular aspect of it would probably pass fair use, because you're using an infinitesimally small piece. The problem is where do you draw the line between the model itself that contains the actual derivative complete image, right? So the database itself, the backbone is built on images, complete images, 100% derivative copies that like should not have been created to begin with. So the entire image exists in the database. Now they're links, right? So it's a link to where the image exists somewhere else. But I mean, the idea is still there. It's a picture that is being used to train the model, a complete picture. So in that respect, it absolutely fails fair use because it's using the entire image, but the resulting image may only use, a tiny, tiny fraction of a million different images. And in that respect, I could make the argument that passes fair use, but it still fails if you try to commercially use it. I think it still fails. I think if, as far as the market value of the original work competing with people. I can't make an argument that it's a fair use to, for those two aspects. Even if it does pass one or two, it doesn't pass them all.
So if somebody wasn't using it commercially, they were just using it on their own, that's follows fair use?
To me, sure. Like if you're using AI and you're creating images for editorial or educational or just for personal use. I screw around with Midjourney all the time. It's fun to play around with. Like, it's cool tech. I love cool tech. Like, I'm not anti-AI. I think AI is really cool. Like, I play around with it personally all the time. But at the same time, like, I couldn't commercially, put something out there, even though, like, I probably have my own images worked into some database somewhere. Like, I couldn't do that personally, knowing, like, I just can't make that, like, I can't make that leap, not yet. There's just too many, like, there's too many questions still, basically, for me.
Right.
Too many things still up in the air.
So that sort of leads into the fact that, so it's not, right now, it's not illegal for anyone to use these or even to sell the images with them, right? Amazon has started asking the question when you upload a book to KDP about whether you've used AI, anything, images, text, whatever, but they're not blocking it. They're collecting the data and nobody knows why, right? But it could be so that if and when this does become illegal, they can then say, okay, all these ones are out.
There goes.
and that should be something that authors should consider, is, whether or not you want to take the chance that might happen. Now, let's talk about the realities of whether that will happen. Like, first of all, who knows when these cases will get
probably not for years. It's probably going to be a long time.
Right. Now, what is the likely outcome? Obviously, we're guessing, we're talking out of our ass. But to me, I don't see this becoming illegal, right? There's way too much money behind and too many huge companies behind pushing this forward. And I think we know that kind of lobbying is very, very effectual in terms of the way the laws work, right? So right or wrong, the money is going to push this stuff forward, in my opinion. Now, it doesn't mean that I think necessarily it'll be do whatever you want. There might be rules around it, and maybe it'll become sort of like how the music industry fought against streaming, and then, eventually they figured out a sort of a compensation model. So maybe at least with the commercial products, to be able to use a model, they will have to have compensated all of the artists that were in the model. But I think that if that becomes an amount that's too hard for the market to bear, they'll just figure out ways to create, say, open source models, where opt-in models, where people just say, listen, I don't mind if people use my art. I'd love that, because then that sort of immortalizes me more. So yeah, here, take my art, or take these public domain images, take all this, and they'll create, let's say, ethically sourced model sets. Right, where it's like, this set has nothing in it that anyone objects to, and then maybe that's how they'll go forward, right? That's sort of the way that I see it going. But I don't know. What do you think is going to happen here?
I think that's probably where it's going to land. I think that there will eventually be ethical models that people can opt in or opt out of. The opting out has already started. There already is header information you can put in your website to tell Google to, like, not crawl your shit for, its AI model. Whether or not it listens to that is, not here nor there. But you can technically start opting out here and there. I think that will start to be a thing. I think that there will eventually be ethical models that will have a huge database of all public domain material, but then you can also feed into it whether or not you're compensated for that, or whether or not that means you get use of the model for free, whether when other people have to pay for it or whatever, who knows? But I mean, I think probably what's going to happen is that when eventually this gets to the end game, because I mean, there are lawsuits already against OpenAI, against Midjourney, against some of the other companies. I think that they'll eventually get to the Supreme Court, and fair use is going to cut it off. I don't think they're going to be able to say with a straight face, like, well, I mean, it's already done, whatever. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that they'll say, okay, like, what's the path forward? So they'll probably, the services that everyone is using now, like Midjourney and Stable Diffusion, the models that everybody's using now are going to be very different in a few years. Because I do think that eventually, like, you're not going to be able to use the copyrighted content that most of these models are built on right now. And I think that, but I do think that, I mean, the technology is not going anywhere. I mean, AI is here. It's here. It's staying. It's not going anywhere. It's just going to get bigger. The question is how do we ethically grow and use it, as opposed to, just whatever, like,
yeah,
like,
I mean, it's the Wild West. Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
so right now that's what it is the Wild West. Yeah,
right, and that's always kind of the way it is when new technology comes about.
Mm-hmm.
But where we are now, I think one of the biggest differences is, like, often it's like this one company doing this thing and then you can control them or whatever. But the problem with AI is, and I have this as an example in my own system is, Midjourney and DALL-E and all that stuff. They're those commercial products, and the court can make their rules and they enforce their whatever, and they'll have to do that. But there's the open source version of it, the Stable Diffusion, that I can download off of GitHub, put it on my machine, go to Civet AI, download all these models. That stuff, I mean, there's no way to enforce that those rules will then apply to any of that stuff, because it's all open source stuff that people have on their own machines and run their own way, and they won't have to follow those rules. Just like there are prompts that you can't do in Midjourney that they won't allow, whereas you can do them no problem on your own machine. So if even though they might put in all these rules, you're still going to always end up with those people that aren't going to be affected by them, unfortunately. And I kind of feel like that's the way it is with AI in general, right? People talking about with ChatGPT, with all this, with AI stuff in general, is, oh, we need rules around it. We have to make sure that people aren't doing bad things. The problem is you make those rules, and the good guys will follow those rules, but the bad guys won't, and thus the people that aren't following the rules will have this huge advantage, right? When you have AI by commercial companies that have to follow these certain rules and have all these restrictions, and then you have bad actors out there with their own open source where they don't have any of those rules, they'll be able to have a huge advantage over those that follow the rules. And I feel like that's sort of like one of the biggest dangers to me with the AI. It'll be this arms race where the bad guys will always have an advantage if they don't have to follow the rules that the good guys have to follow,
I mean, I guess you could make that argument about any tech, really, though. I mean, like, pretty much
you can, but it's usually not
right.
Yeah, but it's usually not such to open sourced and out there to such a degree and being generated so quickly. Like I was telling you offline, like, when I go to install this stuff, it's like I watch some videos or something, and they're not old videos, but they're all out of date because this stuff is changing so rapidly in the open source space. If you look at where, I don't know, examples like Uber came along and disrupted the taxi industry, and for a while they were doing whatever they wanted, and then eventually rules were put in place or whatever, right? But that's to Uber and that's to Lyft and all those people, right? But in this sense, you can put it against OpenAI and Google and Microsoft, but there's just all that tech is out there, open source, that competes with it in such a different level than different things that where you can't do that. I can't create my own rideshare service. Like it's not the same thing. Like I think that I don't know. There's this big difference to me where open source AI has run. It's just gone crazy. They're almost innovating to a higher level than some of the commercial stuff, because the commercial stuff has a certain amount of engineers working on it in a certain one product, whereas the open source stuff, the stuff that they're doing with that, I mean, they're doing stuff that competes, maybe not to the level of the scale of like ChatGPT's training models, but to what they can do is, it's just getting, every day you see it's moving forward faster and faster, right? And when you start to regulate it and say, hey guys, we got to make sure it's not doing this, they're not going to listen to any of that.
Well, I think that there's probably going to be, I don't think that the open source is going to have like an advantage necessarily, because I mean, with regulation, there is an aspect of safety to that. So I think that you'll see models for commercial services that follow the rules having better models, because you'll have more reputable companies feeding them versus,
right.
Like, I mean, if you have an open source model, who the hell knows, where it comes from, what its pedigree is, like,
right.
you hope
but they're
that
open
it's
source.
good.
So that people can check to make sure that it's not doing anything bad, right? But the problem is, sure, their models might be bigger and stronger, but my concern is more that the rules of saying, you can't do this and you can't do that with your AI because it's dangerous, the open source community won't have to follow those rules, or they can put them in a way that somebody can just download the software and pull those rules out. And we already saw it like back in the early days where somebody created this AI on Twitter. It was like, the end goal was to destabilize the world or something like that.
Yeah.
And it's like, people do that. And, I don't know. That's my fear about, how that's going, but I don't know.
I mean, it's like any other tech. I mean, there's going to be people who use it for nefarious purposes and people who don't. I mean, it's the same as like any, like, I mean, the internet. I mean, when the advent of the internet, people use the internet for good reasons and bad reasons. And, there's people who attack, software, and people who, ethically, like, expose security, issues. So, I mean, I think it's going to be like that. I mean, eventually, yeah, it'll settle, like, where people who are, it'll be like white hat AI use and black hat AI use, like the same way it is with like a lot of tech now. So,
yeah.
Well, I mean, and I just don't. I think that it'll benefit from regulation. I think that like a lot of the ethical and legal concerns will, and I mean not dissolve, but they'll be, they'll have a resolution. It might not be a resolution everybody's thrilled about, but I mean, at that point it becomes, and you're never going to please everyone with any decision that gets made. But at the same time, at that point, it becomes a personal choice, unless if the government says, okay, so this is legal, this is fine, and this is fine in this specific context, it becomes a question of, is that the right choice for me to pursue or not? And at that point, it's, there's no other consideration. Like, that's it. But right now, there's still, if I use this AI to make this book cover, and down the road, if it's illegal, like, is this going to blow up in my face and I have to like recover this book, or does it get pulled from sale?
Illegal. Right.
Yeah, I mean, how well is the detection going? If I lie to Amazon and say my books aren't AI when they are they going to be able to tell? Is my account going to be immediately banned? If there's a billion questions like that, where, to me personally, I feel like I would wait until the regulation is in place before I commercially pull the trigger. But until that happens, I'm fine to play with it in the comfort of my own home, like, you know, and it's still very cool. And I think that there are definitely ethical ways to use AI. Things like, you know, brainstorming or making an outline for a book or rapid prototyping, you know, like an image that you want to draw or something like that. Like, just to see what things look like, you know, like it's a great software for like immediately being able to see like whatever you can think of, literally, you know, like it's great for that. And then going forward with things like book editing, like Grammarly basically is built on AI. So if you use Grammarly for book editing, it's an AI, like, you know, like it's a generative model, like that Grammarly uses. Like but I think that if you're using it for spell checking your own work, I don't see a problem with that. I mean, it's not competing. I mean, there are professional editors there, you know, in that space. And I think that like authors should always use them, because I would never trust a machine to edit a book for me, you know, like
Right.
I'll trust it to check my spelling. But I mean, like, we all use autocorrect, right? Like, I mean, how many times is it wrong? You know, like, how many times you're like,
maybe
stupid damn
maybe
autocorrect?
maybe it'll be better now with AI.
I know, but I guess that's what my point is just
But
that,
not
like,
perfect.
there are ethical ways to use AI now commercially. But book cover, making like copies of books and selling them, I'm not there yet. And I won't be there until all of the pieces fall into place in terms of like the regulation. So we'll see how it goes.
What a brilliant place to wrap this up, because we've reached the top of the hour. But that was like, you couldn't have rehearsed a better way to wrap up that particular debate. I don't think we reached any good conclusions, but I think it was a very interesting discussion.
No, and I don't think that, you know, we can reach any, because it's not.
Yeah,
it's not.
there's no
a
answers
black
yet.
and white. Yeah, there's no.
Yeah,
It's not a black and white thing, right? And that's kind of what we wanted here, is to at least, you know, you know, when I sent out that email that I mentioned earlier, it's like, hey, look what we can do. But what I didn't do, which was, you know, where I missed the point, was to say to people, but listen, we can do this, but think about it first, and think about what you're going to do, and think about what the issues are around this, because they're not resolved yet. And there are people out there that feel one way and people that feel a different way. And you need to understand those arguments so that you understand the way you feel and what you're comfortable with if you decide to move forward or not. So hopefully we've helped that out, that argument out.
Well, absolutely. Well, we shall wrap this up. Nate, if anyone is interested in finding about your cover design and all the other things you do, where can they find out more about you?
I generally post on Hidden Gems, hiddengemsbooks.com. You can also find me on Reddit, where I am Salacious Stories, the moderator of both our erotic authors and our romance authors.
Fantastic. Well, Craig, any final thoughts before we wrap up?
You know, just like I said, just I hope that this was a fair and balanced look at the way that the industry is right now, and sort of the direction it's going, and where we think it might go. This might change. We might update this in a few months to have this discussion again. But for now, hopefully it's a good way for authors that aren't aware of how all of this is unfolding to get a sort of a quick primer on it.
Fantastic. And yes, and you know, this is probably a debate that is going to raise lots of questions and comments and things. So don't be shy about leaving a comment down below about this discussion. While you're down there, if you haven't already, click that subscribe button, hit that like button. There's a bell icon so you get notified every time a new episode comes out. And we'll be back next week with another episode of Fully Booked. So until then, cheerio.